civil society becomes...
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch, broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting Memories Present. Alright, picking up where I left off last time, I did a little bit more detailing, I believe off camera. I added some deep purple to the foreground trees, and some light green to the background trees, and also some window color and a little cabin detail there. But I'm going to start with that area, putting some Naples yellow behind this mountain chain and tapering it up right here, and then some fog right there, a little Naples reflective color down here, some dark brown on the dog's shadow side, and then I'm going to move over with some light purple if time allows and give this tier tree an aura.
Now an oligarchic system, as Aristotle wrote, once you create an oligarchic system with those kinds of inequities, then your only two choices are tyranny or revolution.
You talk about people choosing fascism, people, or the conditions being set for people to almost have no alternative choice. And you've written about this idea. You wrote an article, in fact, that I thought was super interesting, how fascism came. Now, that term itself has its roots in Mussolini's authoritarian rule during World War I. I think of brutal oppression. I think of the crushing of dissent. Is it not hyperbolic at this moment in history to say that that's what we're facing here?
Well, every fascist system has its own peculiar characteristics. So you mentioned Mussolini. That was rooted in ancient Rome, and the glory of Augustus and all this, whereas German fascism was rooted in Teutonic myths, and Spanish fascism under Franco was something different. Robert Paxton, when he writes his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, he calls the Klan the most authentic fascist movement in American history. And again, Paxton, in the book, says that it won't come with jackboots and swastika. It will become with the Christian cross and mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance. And I certainly came away after spending 2 years with the Christian right with the belief that these people, that they had politicized and used Christianity to build a native fascistic movement, of course grounded in white supremacy, and you've seen Trump has no ideology; he's just a grifter, but he has filled that ideological void with these figures like Mike Huckabee, who calls the West Bank Judea and Samaria, or his UN ambassador, who said, suddenly U.S. foreign policy is rooted in biblical myth. That's where we're headed. And so, yes, I see it as, especially as the system disintegrates. And in terms of voting for, any totalitarian movement is grounded in magical thinking. And when the real world becomes so onerous, so oppressive, so exploitive, and you engender that kind of despair, and all the writers of totalitarianism ground the rise of totalitarian movements, Hannah Arendt, Fritz, all of them, in despair, which is what's happened to a significant part of the country, then you reach out for magical thinking. That's what Trump offers. He none of it is coherent, but fascism's not really a coherent ideology. Thesselwaite, in his book, Fantasy, talks about how it's really, at its core, about hypermasculinity. If you look at Trump as a cult figure, in Margaret Singer's book, Cults and Our Myths, it's about endowing your cultish leader with omnipotent power to do anything.
But I push back a little bit, because I hear this a lot, and I don't disagree that there's a cultish tenor to much what we see in the Trump rhetoric and the rhetoric of his followers. But sometimes I worry that using the language of cult makes it seem as if his followers are misled, that they have the world wrong, and that they're always operating against their interests. What do you say to the person who says, well, look, yeah, that might be true in part, but Trump is also advancing policy initiatives that actually are in line with their ideology, whether it's the anti-LGBTQ stuff, whether it's the anti-DEI stuff. There are people who fundamentally believe in what Trump is selling, and they're not being misled. They simply believe things that are in line with the movement.
Well, those are the cultural kind of targets that have been picked out to, I think, mendaciously explain the despair and the economic commiseration that these people live in. The problem is Walmart. The problem is Goldman Sachs, the problem is Citibank, the problem is, but those people are not mentioned. You're mentioning undocumented workers, you're mentioning GBTLQ, people. But let's be clear, let's go back to the Democratic Party, that they abandoned the working class and they spoke in this kind of, scolding, virtue signaling wokeness, rather than being rooted in the class war that has now largely been finished, but the class war against the working poor and the working class, which they were part of. So you have a reaction to this, political correctness, because it was used to demonize a working class that was, being pounded to death. And so yes, there's a reaction, but none of it's dealing with the actual structures of power. None of it's dealing with the reality of why they are where they are. So yeah, they all hate immigrants the way in Nazi Germany they hated Jews, or the way when I was in Bosnia the Serbs hated the Muslims and the Croats hated everybody. And so but that is about transference. It's about the demonization of the other. So in that sense, Trump is a complete grifter, like all demagogues.
Is that what you mean when you talk about the failure of liberalism? You said recently, fascism is always the bastard child of a bankrupt liberalism. Is that bankruptcy about abandoning the working class?
Yeah, it's more than that, but it is largely about that. I mean, I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, and it takes 250 pages.
So why has liberalism failed?
I would go back to the Cold War. So what you did is you created the Cold War liberal. The Cold War liberal was used to eviscerate the left. And remember the breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s, you had powerful, especially union movements, the old CIO, the Wobblies, the Communist Party, which we've written out of our history. We're just talking about the great W.B. Du Bois. He was persecuted and stripped of his passport, arguably America's greatest intellectual, I would say. So the distortion of liberalism, and when Chomsky writes about liberalism correctly, he says liberalism is allowed to exist within a capitalist order because it's a safety valve. It ameliorates the suffering enough to allow capitalism to go forward, which is what FDR did. FDR was pressured into the New Deal reforms by the left, and that's not conjecture, because I've read his private letters to his brother, where he says, if we don't push through these kinds of reforms, including in providing employment for 12 million Americans, public works, all this Social Security, 8-hour workday, all of that was being pushed by sit-down strikes, radical unions, and he said, if we don't carry out these reforms, we will get revolution. Those are his words. That was the fear, the specter of the 1917 revolution loomed large, even in the 1930s, over the Western world. And that liberal class has been destroyed. It was used to eviscerate the left, the Cold War liberal, and eviscerate and destroy those liberals, especially with McCarthyism in the 50s, and Ellen Schrecker has written some very good books on this. And so that creation of the faux, I would call it the faux liberal, the Clintons are kind of classic figures like this, where on the one hand, they are the engine, the political engine behind corporate oppression, and on the other hand, they're holding up, their kind of, pronoun uses and all their woke garbage.
You say woke garbage. So there are people who are going to hear that, because that language of woke has been appropriated by the right in very particular ways to deny the legitimacy of LGBTQ humanity, to deny the legitimacy of affirmative action efforts or integration efforts, or the language of woke itself has been sort of. I mean, you hear Elon Musk using that word. Does it worry you to use that kind of language?
No, because what was wokeness? Wokeness was the corporations love it. They love it. So what is wokeness? A woman CEO? No, it's about empowering working class women. It's a complete inversion.
So you see wokeness as a kind of superficial approach to dealing with identity politics, or do you see identity politics itself?
I see identity politics as furthering the goals and rapaciousness of the corporate state. They've embraced it. I mean, you had years ago when AIDS, you had, what was it, Bennington, or I don't know which one of these big Abercrombie, I don't know, Calvin Klein. They had HIV positive models. I mean, they obviously, I'm all for inclusion and respect, all that kind of stuff. But wokeness in the hands of the ruling class has been used as a cudgel to essentially punish and scold the working class, and also about elevating their own.
But is it just the
virtue.
workplace? I mean, it seems like it's also an attempt to hold the powerful accountable, hold corporations accountable for not being diverse.
Well, yeah,
for not,
come on, Mark, we saw that ad from the CIA, you know, what am I, I'm a trans, binary, and I can torture people in Guantanamo too. I mean, you know, who cares whether, you know, the people bombing, the Israeli Air Force pilots bombing Gaza in the genocide are gay or trans or women, who cares? I mean, it's superficial in a sense that it doesn't deal with the mechanisms of repression.
which for you were always economic.
They're primarily economic, yeah. I mean, the distortions within American society. You can't maintain a democracy if you destroy your middle and working class. You can't, it's impossible. And that's what we've done. And so now we are facing the specter of this, you know, rolling kind of fascism. And you're right, people vote for it. People vote for it out of rage, out of anger, out of desperation. I don't forgive some of the, you know, views of my relatives in Maine, but at the same time I don't demonize them. It's mostly based on ignorance. But the people I can forgive are the people like Elon Musk or Trump. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, these people are racist to the core. I mean, you know, they don't even try and hide it that much, and they're also misogynists and everything else. So it's decoupling of ourselves from economic injustice. And look, this is what all the great, even Martin Luther King at the end, you know, there will be no civil rights until there are economic rights. And he's killed marching with the garbage workers in Memphis. I mean, so, and of course everybody, the liberals all walked away from it. I mean, it's fine if you want to integrate Georgia, because nobody can afford to eat where we eat in Manhattan, so we don't care. But as soon as you talk about economic justice, they went for the door. And King was, as you know, of course, a very lonely figure at the end, and a very courageous, amazing figure, but very lonely. Because of that economic component is key. And it's key to overcoming everything you and I care about. And that's and building a system of justice. But if you extract that drive for economic justice, then it becomes a kind of boutique activism.
Let me ask you something. I want you to put your Christian hat on for a minute. You're actually ordained as a Presbyterian minister.
I don't make that public too much, but that's all right.
Your father was a minister.
Yes, he was.
I mean, you have
That's
deep
right.
roots
I got
in
deep
this
roots.
stuff. Yeah. So, Trump's victory rally, there was a prayer said, and it struck me, and I immediately thought, what would Chris think? The person reading the prayer said, "President Trump, we set the name of the Lord upon you, and we declare that no weapon formed against you will prosper. That every tongue that rises up against you in judgment will be condemned, and if God be for you, who can be against you?" And I said, wow, I've heard that prayer lots of times. I've heard that scripture from Isaiah a lot of times in the black church and other churches. Didn't expect to hear it said over Donald Trump. When you hear it, what do you make of it?
Idolatry. Moloch. Worshipping the feet of Moloch. It's idolatry. It's heresy. It's the sacralization of human and political power, which is probably the greatest sin any religious institution can. Look, the mega churches work like this, and I learned this from Hannah. You have and they have much better seats than we do in the Presbyterian church. They're comfortable, they kind of recline, they got nice music. I mean, nice, it's cheesy, and lights, and they make you feel good. But that is the form of what she calls indoctrination. And all fascist movements do that. They bring you into the warm embrace. I mean, that's the propaganda, sorry. Then they move you to the back room for indoctrination. I went to both. So I went to these prayer meetings. And one of the things I saw in these prayer meetings was the pain on the part of family members who had, quote unquote, been saved, and their family members who weren't. And they occupy, these mega churches occupy all your educational time, your religious time, your social time, your leisure time, whatever it is. They are and they demonize the children who aren't, quote unquote, especially if they're gay. So my friend Mel White, who founded Soul Force, he would go down, ordained minister, he would go down to the steps of these mega churches and hold memorial services for the young gay people in that church who had committed suicide. And he accused them of murder. And it is murder. So you know, it's their propaganda. I mean, I dug deep inside to this Leviathan called the Christian right, that I call American fascists.
And Christian nationalists, right? I mean,
Yeah, they're complete nationalists, and you know what they are is they are essentially the equivalent of the so-called German Christian Church, established under the fascists in Germany, where on one side you had the Christian cross and the other the Nazi. And let's be clear, Mark, this church is bankrolled by the very
Might be able to do that in 12 minutes. We'll
that
see.
we talked about. Why? Because with Magic Jesus, you don't need labor unions. With Magic Jesus, you don't need health care. Because Magic Jesus is going to give you a Cadillac and make all your dreams come true. And that is that shift from a reality-based world into the world of magical thinking. And once people shift into that world of magical thinking, you can't reach them through rational argument.
Is that going to come through the Trump administration 2.0 even more?
Yeah. These are the people who went to this one.
They won the first time too, but it's...
Yeah, but Trump was totally unprepared, unfocused. Now he's got Heritage 2025. I mean, you've seen from, now they're organized. I mean, Trump is a very limited, intellectually, very limited figure. He's a carnival barker, and he his first administration was dogged by one crisis and resignation. I mean, it was just chaos.
Yeah.
That's different this time.
Church and state. The First Amendment ostensibly protects us from the mixing of the two. There's a separation of church and state. At a moment where you're saying the Christian right is overtaking the executive branch, is the separation of church and state under threat?
I kind of balk at calling them a church. They're a political movement. I mean, when I wrote my book, I was very upfront about who I was, where I came from. I graduated from divinity school, and what was fascinating is none of these people ever wanted to talk about the Bible with me because they know those, a kind of selective literalism, where they know those passages that buttress the ideology. They don't know the Bible.
Will those ideologies that are shrouded in religious language, will those things overtake other people's freedom this time around?
Yeah, of course.
Because that's the fear. Is that suddenly people's feelings about... I mean, the first week we see executive orders that define gender and sex in very particular ways that align with their thou shalt nots. How much of that are we going to see?
I mean, as much as they can get away with. I mean, they want to create a quote-unquote Christian nation. They want to go back to, it's this kind of it's a fake fundamentalism, but, the foundational ethics of the quote-unquote founding fathers. I mean, when you said that this was the greatest concentration of wealth in billionaires, I'd love to look back at first the George Washington administration, all the slaveholders, and count up how much money they were worth, because it was a pretty significant part of the economy.
That's an interesting point. But let me pivot, because I have to talk to you about Gaza for all the reasons. It's something you pay careful attention to. You spent a lot of time, obviously, in Gaza during the 7 years that you reported for the police. And this past summer, you were in the West Bank.
Yes.
You're writing your forthcoming book, which is called A Genocide Foretold: Reporting on Survival and Resistance in Occupied Palestine. First, I guess, what do you make of this ceasefire, and particularly the idea that President Trump played a pivotal role in making it happen?
Optics. He wanted a pause. I mean, I think the ceasefire, it'll probably extend a little bit beyond that, but it's really a pause in bombing for the presidential inauguration. It will last. I mean, look, you know the history of the Middle East pretty well too, but every agreement Israel has ever made with the Palestinians is done in phases. Whether that's Camp David, whether that's Oslo, whether it's all the ceasefire agreements, and Israel gets what it wants in the first phase and then violates every other phase. That's a pattern. They've never broken it. So they want the hostage. They want two things. They want the hostages, as many as they can get back, and they want to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia and the so-called Abraham Accords. Once they get that, Netanyahu's already said it, and Trump's special envoy of the Middle East has already said it, that if they quote-unquote violate the Palestinians, the agreement, then the mass slaughter will begin. And of course, as soon as the mass slaughter was paused in Gaza, they turned on the West Bank. especially Janine. So, yeah, they're not done. I mean, you know, anybody who thinks that they're campaigning over erasure and dispossession of the Palestinians, we've seen these kinds of pauses before. So I think that I worked a lot in Gaza, I have a lot of friends in Gaza, some of them are dead, some of them got out, and some of them we hadn't heard from for weeks, they're probably buried under the rubble. I mean, I think for a lot of us who spent time there, it's been really difficult emotionally to watch this live stream genocide, and not just the indifference of the United States, but complete complicity. The fact that people could vote for Harris or Biden, I mean, that's, you know, genocide is not normal governance. I mean, do we have any moral line left? I mean, and...
Well, I get your thoughts on the end of the occupation, the end of apartheid, and whether those things can actually be achieved. Not too long ago, we spoke to Rashid Khalidi, who is Professor Emeritus at Columbia University, and he stated that Israel's connection to the U.S. and Western Europe is fraying every day, and that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated on the global stage. He said sooner or later public opinion is going to have an impact, and it's going to cause support for Israel to stop. Do you agree with that position?
Yes, but it might take a generation.
A generation?
Sure, because this older generation still has a fealty to Israel that the younger generation, including Jews, do not. I mean, I was in a lot of Students for Justice in Palestine meetings, campuses across the country, and 30–40% of them are Jewish. So, yeah, it's terminal, but I know Elon Pape, the great Israeli historian,
I don't think it can do the root structure
I
in
don't think it's that quick.
6 minutes and 16 seconds, so I'm going to stop it here and pick up from take 2 and continue working for as long as I can see some things to do with the color palette that I already have squeezed.
Christian fascists.
Alright,
Because
take
they
2.
have this warped, perverted, biblical view of Christ returning and the rapture, which is in the Bible. And I mean, at its core, if you really examine it, it's pretty anti-Semitic. But I think even Israel has realized that the younger generation of Jews are a lost cause. And so they have wedded themselves to the Christian Zionists. People like Mike Huckabee, who's about to become the ambassador or the UN ambassador. I mean, they're not alone. I mean, but that's a naked kind of fascism. We can get into Israel's distortions itself. It is a proto-fascist system. Yeshayahu Leibowitz, you know, the great Israeli philosopher, kind of saw it coming. They're all the heirs of Meir Kahane. When I worked I lived in Israel. When I worked in Israel, the Koch party was outlawed. And this radical, racist rabbi. These people, I mean, Ben Gvir, I think, was at Kahane's grave on the anniversary of his death not long ago. So and you know, Netanyahu's not stupid. He's pretty evil, but he's not stupid. He said everybody thinks the world is moving towards a kind of enlightenment. No, that's why he builds relationships with Orban and others. He said, no, it's moving towards this kind of authoritarianism, and we're what's coming next. And he may not be wrong. Israel's, you know, becoming, I'm not even for Israelis, a very despotic place. People who have the courage to decry the genocide and the occupation are pariahs. Gideon Levy's, Amir Haas, and amazing journalists from artists. I mean, they have become total outliers within their own society.
You talk about journalism. You were the Middle East bureau chief of the New York Times for several years. Of course, you quit because they reprimanded you.
Well, no, I didn't quit. They keep reminding me when I see them. What they do is suddenly you're the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. It's like the old Soviet party where you get to stand up, you know, with all the other old people and look at the May Day parade or whatever, and then you suddenly find yourself in Tajikistan. So you're on night rewrite. I mean, they put you in a dead end, and they knew I'd leave. So, but I ran into the executive editor a couple of years ago. Dean McKinney ran across the room and said, "We did not fire you. We did." Okay. But,
okay.
Yeah.
So you were not fired.
I want to clear that up for your New York Times viewers.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But whatever experience you had there, it was in direct response to your opposition to the Iraq War.
Yeah.
But
also Palestine.
And Palestine.
Because
sure.
I had taken vacation time and written a magazine piece in Harper's called The Gaza Diary. And the Times went apoplectic. And when that was published, I was told you will never report from the Middle East again. So it had already been banned from the Middle East. I opposed the Iraq War, and that was it.
From that moment until now, do you see any different tenor in newsrooms? Do you hear any different sensibilities from the journalism world? Has coverage changed on the Middle East since that time?
Yeah, it's worse. Far worse.
Worse?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, look at the reporting on Gaza. Look at the reporting on the student protests. You know, they go up to Columbia and race off to the Hillel house and talk about how, you know, Jewish students, quote, Jewish students saying they feel uncomfortable. Well, you know what? It's a genocide, you know, perpetrated by the Zionist project that you support, so maybe you should feel uncomfortable.
And you see that as worse than, say, 1982 during the invasion of Lebanon or in the early 2000s?
Yeah, the whole, I mean, you know, we don't have time to critique the New York Times, which was always an elitist publication, beholden to centers of power, never good on Israel, but the space has shrunk, because that's commercial, because you know, they've lost so much advertising, their digital subscriptions they bring in significant revenue, but digital subscribers are very fickle about canceling, so yeah, there's less, I mean, there was space. I worked for them for 15 years. I mean, I was a management, but that space has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And they cater for commercial, not for journalistic reasons, to, they've siloed themselves, and they cater to a particular demographic. They're far more obsequious to that demographic than they were when I worked.
I gotta ask you one more question. Given what we're facing, are traditional forms of protest or dissent enough? Or does the scale of the crisis, the intensity of the suffering people are experiencing right now, does it demand a more radical response than what we've traditionally done? Yeah,
it demands a more radical response because we have to destroy the system. We have to destroy the ruling class. And the only mechanism we have to destroy the ruling class is by disrupting economic, social, and political life. That comes through mass mobilization, primarily through labor and especially through the strike. We have to rebuild militant labor movements that shut the country down. That's the only way out of this. And the oligarchs have understood this for a long time. It's why they have made war against organized labor for a long time. Only 11% of the U.S. workforce is unionized, but we have to regain that militancy. We have to understand who our enemy is, and that if we don't break the back of that enemy, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. And we have to understand the only power we have is collective, and it will require sacrifice. And I mean, we had the bloodiest labor wars of any industrialized country. Hundreds of American workers were killed. Thousands, probably tens of thousands were blacklisted. You know, Joe Hill, you know all this. You know, that we got to look back, because the capitalist class, you know, they're going to use every vicious mechanism they have, because it's all, you saw the way, you know, they essentially made it impossible. Without that corporate money, Bernie Sanders would have won against Trump the first time around. And I believe he would have won. But they destroyed it. They destroyed that possibility. So
are you hopeful that we're close to that moment? Are we on the precipice of a radical moment of resistance? Are we on the verge of toppling power?
No, because the left has been so decimated. So we don't have the left we had in the 30s. Europe went one way, fascist. We went another way, which was quasi-socialist. But our left has been so decimated and destroyed, I fear, that we don't have the forces of resistance that can, you know, create the kind of space and social equality, liberty that should be fundamental to an open society. So no, I'm actually very pessimistic. However, you know, that's where I fall back on my religious tradition, where it doesn't matter. I mean, you come out of the Black prophetic tradition. You know, boy, if anybody understood the world around them and the forces against them, it was you know, Black America and the Black prophetic tradition, but they fought anyway. And they fought anyway because it wasn't finally what they achieved empirically, it was who they were. It was their own dignity. And we have to protect our own dignity. The soul is real. And if we don't stand up against these rapacious forces of radical evil, our soul will die. And we may not win, but we must save our soul.
Mr. Hayes, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks.
Good stuff.
formal title of the lecture is Nature is the Center of the Mandala. And this is really basically simply a structure to work off of, to anticipate and discuss where nature lies in the future, the cultural future that is unfolding in front of all of us. And these times spent, and then of course there were the times in the Amazon, which most of you have heard me lecture on, where the pursuit of psychedelic plants was really in the forefront. But I came to see nature as experienced, meaning as it hits you when you walk around in it and pick at it and carry it with you, that this kind of nature had been read out of the repertoire of images that most people bring to bear on their reality. And consequently, the reality is de-spirited. The spirit resident in nature is not visible when these mechanistic grids are laid over it, sort of by a kind of anticipatory osmosis. We called our company, which has existed now 10 years or more, Lux Natura. Lux Natura means the light in nature. The Lux Natura is the salvational radiance that can be found in the organic kingdom. It's a term of Paracelsus. And it has slipped from the grip of modern human beings, except in special cases where it is cultivated as a sensitivity, or where it is pursued in the guise of an aspect of the psychedelic experience. So what is nature, and what's so great about it that it should be the center of the mandala? Well, it seems to me that it is psyche in a way that has become occluded by the perverse development of language, so that what we take to be exterior to ourselves and sustained by the laws of physics, which do not arise out of the human mind, is in fact not that at all, but a kind of stratum of expectation that has been laid down by the human journey through time. Now, granted, there are aspects of nature which are not part of the human journey through time, but they are occult from our point of view. They are not expressed, except perhaps through the demonic artifice of an instrumentality. And this has been the course, or the strategy of science, is to use an instrumentality to reveal the mechanics of the occult side of nature. The problem is that this occult side of nature, once explicated, does not yield a satisfying reflection of ourselves. It yields instead a very unflattering reflection of ourselves, if any at all. So, in Hawaii, sitting on the mountainside, you think that we are like Lenin in Germany or something, and you have to politically think it all through so that to whatever degree one's voice is heard, mistakes are not made. Because it seems to me clear that a small miracle is taking place. It is that, and I was saying this to Roy today, it is that our point of view is actually gaining ground. The thing which we least expected to happen, I think, that all this new age hustle and bustle, though granted that 95% of it is just intellectual noise and efforts that fail, efforts to coin the perfect analogy that fail, nevertheless, there is a residual 5% that appears to have become the cutting edge of the guiding image of this megaculture. So it becomes important then for people who identify themselves with the human potential movement, spiritual development, the rebirth of intuition, all of these things, to make a place in the plan for the role of nature. And different responses have gone on to that. The Gaia response, which claims nature as a stabilizing feminine force, which I'm all for that. I think that's definitely the image that has to emerge, that the recognition of the presence of control mechanisms which are not coercive, but which are Taoistic, is a way of coming to terms with nature that we have resisted. This is, it's a simple idea. It's just the idea that before technology, people had to store firewood in the autumn for the winter, and in the spring they had to sharpen tools for the late spring planting and this sort of thing. That there was an implicit rhythm laid down by nature that entered the human cosmos at every level, and then it was reflected in the poetry, the culture building, the language evolution, etc. And that when urbanization, other factors removed the influence of these rhythms, ending in the final culmination of the modern city where life under electric light goes on 24 hours a day, there's then a flattening of the human dimension. There is no more a sense of being embedded in flux. There is instead the myth of the eternal culture. It's like Woody Allen, his comment that he didn't like to go to the country because you see all these screen doors with cobwebs in the corner. Well, you got to come to terms with this kind of thing. Because there is no question that there is a deepening ambiguity in the present moment. There is a something stealing over global civilization. I was at a conference recently where someone proposed the notion that our time is not special, that there is nothing unique about this moment other than that it is presently occurring. I think nothing could be further from the truth, and that actually the deepening ambiguity of the historical experience, which registers in all of us as a sense of how weird it is, how compressed time is, how complicated the interconnections are, is a real phenomenon which eventually will be elucidated. In other words, it will be recognized as a phenomenon. Eventually, there is going to be a break with the prevailing paradigm of historical process. In case you're not aware of it, the prevailing paradigm of historical process is the one which calls itself the trendlessly fluctuating theory. And it says, we trendlessly fluctuate. And to search for a trend is to just be drawn into a kind of cultural hysteria. The fact of the matter is that standing outside the cultural hysteria, the trend is fairly clear. It is a trend toward temporal compression and the emergence of ambiguity. How is it possible? You look at something like Common Ground or even the Shared Visions newsletter, and you say, apparently the major commodity moving on world markets is ambiguity. the voices which whisper to us from crystals, herbs, and housewives, the invisible fields from all dimensions which impinge upon us, the imagined histories and futures which intersect the present moment. I mean, if all of these models, or even a small portion of them, are given credence, then the density of the human experience is considerably deepened. I mean, how many past lives can you keep track of? How many extraterrestrial channels can you have open before you begin to realize that, you're not living in the kind of society like mom and dad were used to? So, back to the theme of nature. Nature anticipates all of this and anchors it. Nature is actually the goal at the end of history. We're getting closer and closer to the end of history, and we will not go past it with a moment of blindness. There will be vouchsafed intuitions about the emerging structure of the other into which culture is being subsumed. You're all familiar with the image of the Ouroboros, the snake which takes its tail in its mouth. Well, the end of history, which you heard me talk about as an archaic revival, that's true, an archaic revival, but the ground of being in which the original archaic renaissance occurred was nature. So in terms of the expression of design elements, in terms of the expression of human relationships, political agendas, all of these things, the economies of nature are going to set the guiding images. It's very interesting. I read Stephen Jay Gould's book, Biophilia, in which he describes his work with ants in Suriname, and how there are ants which grow fungi in their nests. They cut leaves off trees and chew them up into this mash, which they then store in rooms underground, and they bring the right spores to it and grow it there, and it produces a sugar which the ants then eat, and they tend the fungal gardens. They actually remove foreign spores and this sort of thing, and the whole symbiosis goes on. Well, it's a symbiosis between a social organism, the ant, and a fungal organism which is able to provide an enzyme, sugar, which drives the ant society to a greater state of activity. Activity being the bottom line in an insect economy, where how much you can get done determines how well you survive, provided the trios of getting done are well established.
All right.
Well,
so that accomplishes everything we set out to do this session, and a little bit more. So we've got some paw shading happening here with the dog's legs, sort of reintegrating these tones around various portions of the canvas to start evening out the color composition and balancing the density of elements on each side. This fog may have been a little heavy. I may redo all of that. But for the moment, that's it. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting. Memories present. Have a good afternoon, Earth.